But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we bring you stories of influential leaders, pivotal decisions, and their long-lasting impacts on history. Today, we delve into the life and legacy of Tecumseh, the extraordinary Shawnee chief who played a crucial role in the War of 1812. Tecumseh's vision of uniting Native American tribes into a confederacy to resist American expansion marked him as a key figure in the struggle for Indigenous rights and territory. We'll explore his early life, his partnership with his brother, also known as the Prophet, and the formation of his Native American Confederacy. We'll also examine his strategic alliance with the British during the War of 1812, highlighting key moments like the Siege of Detroit and the Battle of the Thames, where his leadership was both brilliant and tragic. Through expert insights and historical accounts, we'll trace Tecumseh's unwavering dedication to his people and his lasting impact on Native American history and U.S. Canada relations. Join us for an engaging and thought-provoking episode that honors Tecumseh's visionary leadership and enduring legacy in the War of 1812.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're heading to North America and looking at one of the great Native American leaders, and that's Tecumseh. And for us as Canadians, we recognize him as, a name that's plastered around schools, hospitals, streets, all over the country. And, for me, even coming into this, I was surprised to learn that most of what he did was centered, in the United States. But I think, as we'll learn with this time, borders were a little bit loosely drawn at this time. The United States versus Canada versus British territory, Native territory, that's all kind of changing really, really quickly. So he has this really, really profound impact on, the country of Canada today, the United States, and all of the relationships with the British and other Native groups within this time period. So this is going to be really, really interesting because, as we were just talking before, Richie, I think the world is at war, when he comes into the world, and there's so many key pieces that are moving around across the entire globe. But this North American theater gets really, really interesting because we start to see the rise of the United States. We start to see British Canada starting to evolve into a point where it'll become a country. And you see all these Native groups trying to just find their place in this world and understand, do they all band together? Are they still individual tribes? How do they keep their identity without being destroyed? And it's just a really, really crazy time period for pretty much everybody involved.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The complexity of this period is very interesting because there's so much going on at the global stage as well that impacts what we're going to be talking about on kind of this like North American theater. I personally probably go a little too detailed when it comes to these episodes because I always want to vindicate the idea that Canadian history is boring. And I think my goal for this one is to just showcase it's not. It is awesome. It is pretty violent. There's a lot going on. The geopolitical ramifications of what happens in North America is huge. And I think that's what this episode is going to really get to the heart of while kind of talking about, this extraordinary, chief and warrior, which is Tecumseh.
Yeah, I think especially as Canadians growing up, right, you see the world as, we are the peaceful Canadians and we made a country and it's all great and everyone's shaking hands and, we didn't have a revolution like those Americans. But, as we'll see here, you're right, there's a lot of bloodshed, there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of change, and there's just a lot of uncertainty on what this part of the world is going to end up looking like. And we had talked about Sir John A. Macdonald way back when in the first episode we ever did. So you can see, there's not a huge amount of time from Tecumseh's life to Sir John A. Macdonald. And, it's almost like two completely different worlds at this point. And that, I think, just goes to show how much changes, how much violence there is, how much war there is to really get to a point where we can say, okay, this is Canada, this is the United States, and we have some sort of, stability in the region.
Yeah. And I think you made a really good point in your introduction about, where do the, Indigenous groups kind of fit into this? And I think throughout the context that I'll get into, what ultimately I kind of walked away with thinking is like, you have the expansion of the U.S. and the solidification of the United States of America. You have this country that is, slowly becoming Canada, or which will eventually become Canada. And you you have these indigenous groups that are now wedged between these two growing powers. It creates such a strange and crazy dichotomy for, how do we ally ourselves? Where do we fit? What's our place in this new world? And I think that is one of those themes that, in Canadian history we talk about, but it's so complicated that it's hard to get like meaningful analysis out of it.
Yeah. And I think you're right. Like you have to take almost a global perspective to understand what's going on in a small part of what we would call Canada today, which seems a little counterintuitive to be like, just talk about what's happening in Canada. But you're right. Like, this isn't just North America that's changing. It's the whole world that's changing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's maybe where we should start, Richie, is maybe tell us a little bit about what's happening over in Europe. How is this affecting the North American theater of all of these conflicts that are happening? Because it's going to come really quickly to Tecumseh's front step, and he's going to be a key player in how this all kind of wraps up for the British, the Americans, and all of those native groups.
Yeah, 100%. I think probably a good place to start is just around some timelines. So I know we're talking about Tecumseh, and I know, Paul, you're going to get into his bio with a lot more detail, but really, the timelines we're talking about for the majority of the episode, he's born 1768, he dies in 1813. Canada becomes a country in 1867. So just to kind of ground this discussion a bit, there's a lot going on in Canada, the US, and Europe preceding Tecumseh's lifetime, all of which is somewhat entangled and it's complicated. So I'm going to try to do my best to make this, as simple and straightforward as I can. But I think a good starting point is trying to establish how the British got here in how they kind of become the authoritative rulers in Canada. So the British established control over Canada following their victory in the French-Indian War from 1754 to 1763. Globally, this war is known as the 7 Years' War. So the French-Indian War is kind of the North American theater of the broader 7 Years' War, which is happening in Europe between Britain and France. The 7 Years' War concludes with the First Treaty of Paris, which is 1763. It concludes the conflict, and essentially, for the purposes of this episode, it cedes the French territories in North America to Britain. This is pretty massive because the victory essentially ends nearly 150 years of French colonial rule in Canada, which began with Samuel de Champlain's founding of Quebec in 1608. So you're seeing a pretty massive shift in like the world hegemony in terms of who has become kind of the de facto world power. The loss, I guess the triumph of Britain over France kind of makes Britain at this point in time the de facto world power across the globe. So you're going to see this establishment of British rule in Canada. Related to that, you're going to see an influx of loyalists to, British power fleeing the American Revolutionary War, which continues to solidify British control within Canada and kind of shapes the demographic and political landscape of Canada for decades to come. So when we're talking about British colonial rule, you have the division of territories in Canada. So you have Upper Canada, which is modern day Ontario. You have Lower Canada, which is modern day Quebec. This was instituted by the Constitutional Act of 1791. And essentially each had its own government, legal system, and land policies. They were governed by lieutenant generals, legislative bodies, which reflected British colonial rule. Upper Canada followed British common law, while Lower Canada retained French civil law under the Quebec Act of 1774. So you can see this division still. You see the legacy of the French, but Great Britain is the de facto ruler and administrator of the Canadian territories at this point in time.
Yeah, I think it's really important to see how this kind of just almost, it doesn't necessarily destabilize the region. It maybe stabilizes parts of it. But if I'm looking at this whole situation from an American perspective, if I'm looking at the 13 colonies, this is not good news, because what we see in the American Revolution is how influential the French are in helping support the American revolutionaries fight back against the British. But they do not have this strong foothold in Canada anymore. So this is, this almost becomes, you kind of leave the revolutionaries kind of to their own devices here. And you can, as the French, you can support them where you can. But at the same time, you're kind of surrounded on all sides. Like when it comes to, if the British have to bring supplies and all of these things from Europe, they have not only a landing place, but they also have a place to recruit troops from. And you mentioned a lot of these loyalists moving into Canada as another place to potentially attack these revolutionaries. And that's going to become a key theme, right? As the British continue to mold Canada into this province / kind of overseas territory, you're going to kind of have to start to look at how are the Americans seeing all of this, because to them, the British are still the big bad enemy and they could attack at any time, and they're going to want their colonies back and all these sort of things. So it's something it's important to see in the future. But I think you're right. Like Britain is now the ultimate power not only in the world, but especially in North America. And despite even the revolution happening, Britain still has a very, very large control over everything that happens, not just on land, but also within the sea, and then even in the Caribbean and those sort of areas too. They're still the ultimate power at this point.
I think that's such a good point. And I think probably to double down on that is, with all of the authority that they have in North America and how well established they are, they can kind of they're in a position to even wage, like land and military based warfare, but almost economic warfare as well. So, we talk a lot about Canadian history, about the fur trade and timber and fish. This is like a generic trope of Canadian history. If you could talk about the Hudson's Bay Company and the fur trade, people think you understand Canadian history, which, saddens me, but it's much more complicated than that. At this point in time, kind of the very popularized economic theory of like mercantilism is what the British are putting forward, as well as other European powers. Essentially, this is an economic theory and practice that emphasizes government regulation of a nation's economy to support state power at the expense of rival national powers, primarily through policies aimed at like accumulating monetary reserves by maximizing exports and minimizing imports. So always kind of operating with this economic surplus at the behest of weakening other, nations. And you can think about this from the point that you raised, Paul, is that Great Britain is well solidified as the powerhouse in North America and South America. So they're really able to drive all of the economics and, ports and trade just by virtue of the level of autonomy and authority that they have. So you can see this from a United States perspective, how this could be very, very intimidating.
Absolutely. And if you think of where the United States is sitting, when it comes to trade partners, right, you have the Mexicans and the Spanish to the south, and those relationships aren't good. You have the Portuguese and the Spanish and a bunch of crazy stuff happening in South America. So these land trading opportunities are not great. You can't go north to Canada due to the fact that this is maybe hostile, but kind of teetering on the edge of breaking into another war with the British. Your only way to really get your goods outside of the United States is by sea. And as we've talked about, the Royal Navy basically owns the Atlantic Ocean at this point. They dictate what comes in, what comes out. And you can start to see, right, yes, the United States becomes a country in 1776. They become free and, can govern themselves. But to be able to thrive as a nation, you need to be able to have this economic growth and all of those sort of things that come with it. And it's going to be really, really hard for the United States to do that and until they really start to build up themselves and become the ultimate power that they are. But you can definitely see, like you were saying, Britain is still the ultimate master here. And they can really, maybe not decide what happens to the United States, but they can really stunt the growth and they can, throttle kind of what's happening based on where they can pour resources, into the North American theater of the variety of conflicts that are happening at this point.
Exactly. And I think that just adds perfectly to the next factor of this kind of geopolitical calculus that we need to consider for this episode, which is, the U.S. So essentially, I'm going to give you a few sentences on U.S. history, but it began with the 13 British colonies, which were established along the eastern seaboard in North America, starting with Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. But, as we know, tensions between these colonies and Britain escalated over issues of, taxation and governance, the famous quote, taxation without representation, which led to the American Revolutionary War of 1775. The war ended with the Second Treaty of Paris of 1783, in which Britain recognized the independence of the United States. The victory allowed this new nation to kind of have its own authority, its own autonomy, be self-governing, but kick off this thing that, historians call manifest destiny, which set the stage for it to, grow into this continental powerhouse. Maybe just a quick point, because I got confused in my research on why there was, several treaties of Paris. And the reason this is the case is because at this point in time in history, Paris is like the central hub of global diplomacy. So it's like a neutral ground where parties can come and they can, come to these agreements. So that's why you see so many treaties of Paris, because this is where, both sides can come on neutral ground and actually come to an agreement on what each kind of party is giving up or winning from these battles.
And it's a great excuse to go to Paris as well. So I'm sure that plays a factor. Yeah. There's worse places you could go. But I think you make an interesting point about manifest destiny and this westward expansion of the United States and even in Canada to some extent. But I think the thing when people think about this manifest destiny, they think of these, wide open plains and, this this untapped natural beauty of moving westward, which is definitely true. But there's also a lot of people that live there. And, they're not going to be too happy when, official U.S. policy is move west, settle westward so we can claim this territory. And I think that's where Tecumseh and a lot of his people come into play here, because, you're looking at lands like Ohio and Kentucky and these places where you're starting to move west, and there's people who've been established there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, who aren't going to be too happy with, all of these settlers moving in and saying, well, I have the legal right to set up a farm here or to set up a town here. And the native groups saying, well, I don't recognize your legal right, quote unquote. And, we can see very quickly how relationships are going to be very, very tense, for a long, long time between these groups.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it continues, right? Like it isn't just this period, Manifest Destiny spans, the better part of a century from my understanding. And it's this very interesting historical concept because it's not really pinned to a particular specific time period or, a particular set of actors. It is this very broad conceptual theory, which is so interesting. I remember taking a U.S. history course when I was doing my, my BA, and I just became so interested in this idea because it's so broad and encapsulating, and it's so hard for an historian to kind of pin down how do you actually scope what Manifest Destiny is, but I'll try my best to define it for our listeners. It's essentially this 19th century doctrine and / belief that it was the divine mission and inevitable fate of the U.S. to expand its territory across the entire North American continent from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. And this ideology, was more or less used to justify territorial expansion of the U.S. and was a driving force behind the annexation of very large regions, including Texas, Oregon, California, and also justified the displacement and often violent removal of Indigenous peoples from ancestral lands. So it's kind of rooted in this sense of, American cultural, might even be grounded in this kind of racial superiority. And it played a key role in kind of shaping the nation's policies and attitudes towards, kind of westward expansion at this time.
To be honest, when you said, divine kind of right, all I could think about is the conquistadors. And when we talked about Cortez and Montezuma, it was this, we have a God-given right to do this. God is telling us that we need to spread the word of God to these people who are, they would say are savages because, they're not believing in the one true God, and they're not believing in Christianity and those sort of things. So I think the move westward here isn't as maybe religiously charged as we would have seen a few years ago, but I'm sure that's still an element there of, Christianity is the right 100%. Way to do things. We need to spread it to a lot of people. We do see a lot of missionaries move, into these, indigenous groups. So yeah, you're right. There's definitely, I'm sure, a racial element to it, religious element to it. But then also we talked about it way back when we talked about Sir John A. Macdonald and this westward movement is this area is not under, officially claimed by anybody. The Spanish and then eventually the Mexicans are going to start moving into California and into Texas. The British may start moving more southward into these lands. So all of these countries are trying to really solidify their hold on this, untapped land in their eyes. Because if they don't, someone else is going to get there. So it's almost like this weird arms race mixed in with this racial / cultural superiority. I think that's kind of coming into this. And it doesn't end well for the indigenous groups. But, when you have all these great powers kind of all thinking in the same way, the results are kind of inevitable, unfortunately.
And it's such a stark contrast to the, kind of indigenous way of life, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point. But these are very Eurocentric ideas of divine rights of expansion, which, are kind of create this polarity between the indigenous groups that we're going to talk about and the U.S. and Canada at this time.
Yeah. And even unification is it's a different concept for a lot of these indigenous groups that, unifying under one flag. And because we're all part of something that brings us together. And in the United States' case, hatred of Britain, but also deep Christian beliefs, those sort of things. So yeah, we'll see how that all comes together. But I think this is probably a good time to bring Tecumseh onto the scene. And again, he's growing up in the middle of all of this. He grows up in what was known as part of the Shawnee people. So he grew up in a small village along the Mad River, which is now in Ohio. His father was a warrior chief, but he grows up into this world of just constant threats of violence as European settlers are slowly encroaching upon Native American lands. And, he sees it right away. He's a young boy and his father's killed at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774, a conflict between Native Americans and Virginia militiamen. The Native Americans called the militiamen, or basically Americans, they called them the Long Knives. So that might be a term we'll use a little bit as we go forward. But as a result, they were forced to give up their land to the south of the Ohio River, which is in modern day Kentucky. So there's this, Tecumseh, he's seeing this. He'll move somewhere, more encroachment from Americans. He has to move again. There's conflict. And it just kind of seems to be this like ever ending cycle. And he's displaced because of this westward movement of American settlers. And especially, the death of his father, it had a very profound impact on him. And it really instilled this deep sense of resistance against American settlers. And this was a relationship that I didn't think I was going to be able to make. But Tecumseh and Hannibal have very interesting kind of origin stories. Both are probably fake. But anyways, apparently his father, when he was dying, basically made him promise that he would never make peace with the Americans. You're always going to fight back against the Americans, which is similar to when Hannibal said, he will never become a friend of Rome. So, most historians believe both of those stories are probably fake, especially if his father was killed in battle. It's not like Tecumseh's going to run out and be able to speak to him maybe before. But this is kind of the world he grows up in, is this deep, deep hatred of the Americans. He's seeing villages burned by American raiders and just this constant threat of conflict that's happening between, both sides in this conflict.
What an interesting comparison. That would probably have been the last thing I expected you to say at this point in the episode, but it kind of fits though. And I think it does, historically, it's good marketing. It's one of probably the reasons of those stories that we still think about and kind of solidify this very ominous role of Tecumseh within Canadian history.
Yeah. And again, look who he's going up against, right? Like technologically, they're not as superior. Numerically, they're not as superior. Even tactically, they're not familiar with European styles of warfare, but which also goes to their advantage in some cases, especially when fighting, on your home turf. So that's where Tecumseh kind of dedicates his life. He's trained as a warrior under a lot of elders who are, very experienced in combat. And by the time he was a teenager, he was participating in raids against American settlers who were encroaching on their territory. So he quickly gained reputation for bravery, leadership skills, and just really a great warrior. So his first battle was likely when he was 15 years old. His tribe attacked a fleet of boats that were on one of the rivers near their territory, and they killed everybody but one man. And this last man was burned alive by his tribe. And so I have a quote here that I think really kind of sums up who Tecumseh was and kind of why I think he was so successful, because we definitely see this kind of violence coming from a lot of these native groups as like revenge, and we got to protect our territory at all costs. And sometimes that means being, almost brutal to prisoners of war and those sort of things. That's what we're going to do. But Tecumseh's got a bit more of a progressive view on this, where he understands that, war is war, people are people, and to kind of go to that extra level is not necessarily the right thing to do. So after this man is burned, a writer says he came out and spoke passionately against the action. He said, "What bravery, what courage, what strength is there in torturing a man who is unable to defend himself? An enemy he was, yes. Death he deserved, yes, but the death of a man, not that of a rat, cornered and tied and burned alive. How have we the right to call ourselves warriors or even men if we act in such a manner? Never again will I take part in the torture like this for any living creature, man or animal." So for Tecumseh, we see this as definitely a trend within his life. He definitely has a respect for people. He definitely doesn't want to kind of go down this route of being seen as, someone who tortures I wouldn't say innocent people, but, you could easily have just killed this person, but, to burn them alive and to make a spectacle out of it. And, even when we think of the United States, like, no cruel and unusual punishment for prisoners. Mm-hmm. Is kind of where he's thinking. Now, this quote is most likely not word for word what he said. Again, this is kind of a theme with Tecumseh. A lot of the things are written after the fact and, from writers and eyewitness accounts and that sort of thing. But we do see throughout his life that this is a theme. So sure, maybe he didn't say that exact thing at that time. But if you were to stitch a lot of his thoughts together and things that he said, that would probably be really representative of his thought around, the concept of torture and, burning alive of prisoners of war.
It's a powerful quote. And I think as you were reciting it, this idea of him kind of being, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more, this kind of merciful leader, right? And I think, from the backlog of episodes that we've done thus far, there's kind of two camps of leaders. There's the merciful and there's the merciless. I think of people like, Vlad the Impaler, who would probably fall in the later camp of merciless and who seem to truly enjoy torturing people and killing people and making these, massive shows to kind of flex his authority on the population. Whereas with Tecumseh, and I think, just from doing some broad research, he is someone who is balanced in a very violent world. To your point, was this person innocent? No. Like in the scheme of what we're talking about, no, because he belonged to the opposition. But does that require him to be burned alive and tortured? Right. I think it really starts to pick at the kind of person and personality and leader that Tecumseh is.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to describe it, because when you're talking about like the merciful and the merciless, in his case, like he finds, I think, a very fine balance between being a respectable person, but not being a weak person. Like Tecumseh was known for being very ferocious and someone you did not want to go up against, but he also was known for being reasonable and someone who had this level of respect. And I think Vlad the Impaler is a perfect example of, he probably was most likely a sadist, but like would love to see the pain and suffering of people. And that was kind of how he, used control, where Tecumseh's not like that. He uses that element, but he uses it in maybe a more controlled setting, which is warfare and defending his people. But when it comes to how he deals with specific enemies, not within that, realm of combat, it's not going to be maybe how we've seen, warfare kind of take place over the last few hundred years. So, after this, he continues to fight in more battles. He is part of the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1794. And this battle was part of a border conflict known as the Northwest Indian War, which a confederation of Native American tribes fought against the United States for control of the Northwest Territory. Although the Native forces were defeated, again, Tecumseh's leadership and valor were widely recognized. And so he's definitely starting to build this reputation, not only amongst the native groups, but amongst the Americans and the British. People are starting to hear a little bit about him. They're facing him in combat and starting to understand that, he's one of the leaders, not necessarily as a full-on revolutionary, but definitely as someone who's going to be pushing back a lot against what the Americans are trying to do. And we'll see a lot of, as we go through this, when he's meeting with Americans and the British, they're very well aware of who he is and what he's doing. And he constantly is spending time trying to negotiate his way out of problems. But a lot of times that doesn't work and conflict ensues. So to be able to get to that point, he has to have the respect of the groups that he's fighting with and fighting for. And he seems like he's been able to do that for, the vast majority of his younger life.
I think you could see some elements, and these are just like broad brushstrokes, because I know I didn't focus as much on the biography, but what I kept coming across was, great orator, great leader, ability to kind of like build alliances, like a very strategic thinker. And I think you're already seeing elements of it very early in his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I think, where it really starts to come into play. He's starting to branch outside of just his specific group. So there's the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which forced many Native American tribes to cede large portions of their lands to the American government. And Tecumseh saw this and was very, very upset, because basically in his head is, why are you giving away any of your land? And he actually was trying to push some of the tribes to go back on the treaty. And so he was starting to actually be seen as a bit of a troublemaker within his specific tribe, amongst the Shawnee and amongst other types of indigenous groups, because they were kind of saying, look, we've agreed to this. We gave them, we've signed a treaty. Why you keep pushing back against this? You're going to ruin everything, that kind of stuff. So, but I think Tecumseh's a smart guy, and I think, he's been fighting the Americans for so long. He knows, I think, that we're not going to sign a treaty and it's all going to be great, and we're going to put a hard line in the sand on where these borders are. You give an inch, they'll take a yard, sort of thing. And I think we can see that he's starting to recognize this. So he looks at what's happening and he sees all of these native tribes and native groups, and they're all kind of doing their own thing. And he looks at this and says, the only way we can fight back against the Americans is if we can create this pan-Indian Confederacy, he calls it. And so he starts traveling extensively throughout different groups within the Midwest and Southern United States, urging groups to try to join his Confederacy. And like we mentioned, he was known, like if you were to say, what's the most well-known thing about Tecumseh? It was his ability to speak. He was a very powerful orator. His speeches often emphasized the shared cultural heritage and common interests of the various tribes. He argued that the land belonged to all Native Americans collectively and should not be sold without the consent of all the tribes. So this is a big challenge for Tecumseh and the Native Americans, because Native population may have been seen monolithically by the Americans, and even Tecumseh in this sense, the Americans come in and now eventually you all now see them as a different group of people. Thus, you are now one group where before the Americans, no chance they were one group. They are very ethnically diverse, or at war with each other for many, many years before the Americans showed up in a variety of different ways. There's definitely not a monolithic group. And despite the connections between some groups, there's also some stark differences. So he's trying to kind of shift that mindset to say we need to band together. We need to be seen as one group of the people who were here first. And we have this cultural identity and we can use it to fight back against the Americans. But the challenge is Native American groups culturally didn't operate with a centralized authority. And that's why we don't see these massive native empires. We'll see confederacies where we'll see certain groups come together. But this isn't like you'd see in Europe or we even see in Mexico with the Aztecs and the Maya, where you have, centralized authority within one city and the rest of the groups kind of coming together. They're very much on a tribe by tribe basis. And so a lot of times decisions are made. One tribe decides to do something, even though they have an agreement with another tribe. It's okay. They can do what they want. We're going to do our thing. And you even get points where sometimes specific members of a tribe will just do what they want. And so now you get this, since there's this lack of central authority, you have two things that are coming up. Is it's going to be really hard to get everybody to come together, one, but number two, to even can get everybody under control and doing what this central authority wants. And then on top of that, that's how the Americans look at everything. We have Washington, we have our state governor or whatever that might be. We have a centralized authority, and the actions of the people within that group represent this centralized authority. Where the Native American tribes don't necessarily think the same way or have the cultural setup the same way. And we'll start to see very quickly how the actions of a few people in certain groups automatically get reflected amongst a much larger group, which is not necessarily the right thing. So this is Tecumseh's big challenge, is how we can get everybody to come together, because traditionally, this is just not how it worked within these native groups.
I think that's such a great analysis. And I think it's important to understand that, especially when we're doing like the compare and contrast of how the Indigenous groups kind of fit in this world right now, wedged between, British rule in Canada, this growing power of the continental U.S. at this time, to be able to, build like this broad identity that brings all these Indigenous groups together, even though, to your point, like they are not a monolith. It's easy to discuss them as a monolith. And I think it's a trap that historically we've fallen into for decades. And I think, of late, there's been much more nuance in that type of historical analysis. But, in this particular era, if you're Indian, you're Indian, right? And you do see elements of like certain groups allying with other groups that we'll talk about. The British worked very closely with the Iroquois Confederacy. So there are these kind of strategic alliances, but there is so much difference between these groups internally. So to try to band them together under this one idea is such a massive lift that he's trying to take on.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned like kind of the monolith too, right? Is you definitely, if you talk to Indigenous groups today, they definitely don't want to be seen as a monolith. They want you to know about their individual culture and all these sort of things. But Tecumseh, he definitely grew up in a world where the Shawnee were their own people and they had a very unique language and all its customs and all those sort of things. But he's smart enough to understand that that's not going to work anymore. We have to find a way to unify and fight back against the Americans, because otherwise we're going to just get swallowed off and picked off one by one until, inevitably there's not much left in terms of Native American land. So Tecumseh, another thing is he's just this aggressive negotiator. Americans are writing all the time about, here comes Tecumseh. He would show up with his groups and he would dress sensationally, make kind of a big spectacle of his arrival. And part of it was to scare the pants off of some of the the civilians in the towns that they were going into, to say like, we're here, we mean business. And, if we don't get what we want, this could turn ugly. And do you really want to mess with guys that look like us who are really trying to establish ourselves? But again, when it got down to brass tacks, he was known for being very, very aggressive, but also just very, very good at negotiating. He would meet with really high-ranking American officials, and sometimes he'd even send demands to the president of the United States himself. So, again, he's a big deal, right? People know who he is, and he's just trying to find this balance between how do I bring everybody together, but how do I keep the Americans at bay? And we'll see how that gets him into a little bit of trouble, but he needs a unifying factor, because just going and speaking and all of those sort of things, different interests are going to kick in, and how do you really find that glue? And so this is where his brother comes into play. And so his brother didn't really have much going on in his life, but ends up becoming this crucial role. And some say maybe even more critical than Tecumseh actually plays in the overall conflict that's about to come. But he's known as the prophet. And the reason for that is his brother had a series of visions that convinced him that Native Americans needed to reject the European American ways and return to their traditional practice. So his religious movement gained a significant following and complemented Tecumseh's political and military efforts perfectly. And so the story goes that one night he fell ill, was unconscious, and they proclaimed that he was dead. And so Shawnee custom requires that the body remain in a room for half a day so people can come and pay respects before the body is buried. But in that time, he woke up and they're like, oh my God, this is a miracle. He was dead and now he's alive. And he told this story about how he came to a fork in the road. On one side was happiness. The other side was misery. On the happiness side, there was full forest, full of fish and game and just the traditional old ways before the Americans showed up. And then there was a side of misery. And that's if we fall into what the Americans are trying to get us to do, this European way of life. And so he becomes this great prophet. He's able to start bringing everybody together. And they actually found a settlement. So Tecumseh and his brother called Prophetstown. So the prophet, his brother, and Tecumseh are growing this movement where this becomes a huge symbol of this pan-Indian Confederacy and resistance against the Americans. And so it attracted warriors and families from various tribes to come together and really resist this American expansion. So for the Americans, this isn't great news because for them, it was much easier to start picking people off. But as we know, a religious symbol can be a huge force to bring everybody together. And it's funny because as I was reading this, the Dune movies just came out, and one of the lines in how they look at prophets is the way to destroy a prophet. It's not to kill them. It's to try to discredit them. And so that's going to just be interesting as we move forward with the prophet, because, there's this collection here of these native groups with this pan-Indian Confederacy, and they're starting to gain some strength, right? So this is where I think Richie would be good maybe to get into, okay, the British are starting to see this, right? And they know that relationships with the United States aren't great. And the United States are trying to see this and say, how do we kind of put our mark on kind of what's happening here? And the native groups are trying to do their own thing. So now you're starting to get this triangle of these three different nations trying to just find their place within this like kind of fractured, but also very, very unstable place where, war can break out at any second, but also could easily just stay as peaceful.
Yeah, it's a very complicated and entangled, wedge I think the Indigenous groups find themselves in. And like a sentiment that kind of came to mind when I was doing my research was, the enemy of thy enemy is my friend. And I think it kind of fits really well in this scenario because obviously, the Indigenous population is there and they're wedged between these growing powers or well-established powers on one side, a growing power on the other. And, this discussion of how does the U.S. and Canada manage alliances with these Indigenous groups, specifically during Tecumseh's life. And, we can do a bit of a compare and contrast, but there are similarities across both parties. So obviously these are strategic alliances, all in all. Both the U.S. and Canada under British rule did form strategic alliances with Indigenous groups to serve their, military and territorial interests. These alliances were often, aimed at gaining support in conflicts. We're going to talk about the War of 1812, where both sides would kind of seek Indigenous allies to bolster their military efforts. They would do this through treaty making. So both the U.S. and British authorities in Canada engaged in treaty making with the Indigenous groups. The treaties often involved, promises of protection, trade benefits, territorial rights in exchange for military support or land cessions. These treaties, as we know, were tools to kind of formalize alliances and secure territorial claims on both sides. How effective these treaties were in terms of like a long-standing perspective is a different conversation. But, they were more or less opportunistic, I think, when we're looking at how the U.S. and Canada used them. And I think more importantly, where the value in these alliances came was kind of this use of Indigenous knowledge. So both nations relied on the knowledge and expertise of these Indigenous groups for things like navigation, survival skill, even military tactics, because Indigenous warriors were crucial in this kind of style of guerrilla warfare and in navigating difficult terrains. Specifically, when you're talking about, North America, Canada is a very densely forested terrain. And to have, these sets of groups who understand the terrain and can leverage it in battle is so crucial. In terms of like key differences, I think the British Canadian approach, you see longer standing alliances. So the British and Canada had longer standing alliances with certain Indigenous groups. A great example is the Iroquois Confederacy, which dated back to the colonial era and the American Revolutionary War. There's this idea of mutual respect. And I think, this is something we probably have to be a little careful around. in terms of how the Canadians approach alliances with Indigenous groups. So I think it's a nice idea to think there was mutual respect between parties, but we're talking about the late 1700s, early 1800s, culturally, socially. I think there's probably some more nuance here, but there are examples where British leaders, we're going to talk about General Isaac Brock, who did demonstrate a significant level of respect and collaboration with Indigenous leaders like Tecumseh. And, because of that relationship, did treat them like allies and valuable partners, specifically when it came to military strategies. Post-war treatment's a bit of a different can of worms because, support often waned for the Indigenous groups on both sides, but there was still a degree of recognition and respect for their contributions. When we're looking at the American approach, so I think the stark difference here from what I read was the Americans focused much more on short-term opportunistic alliances with Indigenous groups, which were driven often by kind of immediate short-term needs rather than long-term partnerships. And the U.S. is, as is Canada, but I think in this historical example, the U.S. is much more notorious for breaking treaties with Indigenous groups, which kind of led to these repeated cycles of conflict, displacement, and forced removal, and the broader mistrust that I think is kind of underpinning Tecumseh's lifetime. And also, in terms of the American approach, Canada's not really going through this aggressive expansion in the same vein that the U.S. is. So again, this ideology of manifest destiny is fueling very aggressive expansionist policies, which is directly resulting in the systematic displacement and forced removal of Indigenous peoples, which we're seeing like forced relocation of groups like the Cherokee and other tribes.
Yeah, it's just a kind of a crazy time in the sense that like treaties are being signed and sometimes they contradict each other and sometimes they're just not followed. But there's also sometimes, like we mentioned, the centralized authorities are so different. But then you also have like these individuals, like you mentioned, like Sir Isaac Brock is like, he recognizes that there needs to be a long-term alliance with Tecumseh and his people. But the man who comes in after him doesn't really see it the same way or is a little bit more opportunistic. And you're right. It's unfortunate because you do see a lot of the native groups almost be used as a tool. Like we like you. You're so great until I need more land or I need, the war's over, those sort of things. And so I think it's just one of those things that just started off so poorly. And then the distrust continues to grow and grow and grow to a point of, let's be honest, there was probably a point of no return where, a native group is going to sign a treaty to get some temporary peace, but they know exactly what that's going to mean longer term, exactly. Or they're just so desperate, and then smallpox is raging through a lot of these groups where, it makes things even more difficult to fight back. But to come back to Tecumseh, he's gaining a little bit more traction here. The prophet is doing his thing. And, the Americans are a little bit alarmed, right? They're like, this is kind of turning into something. Like, we need to be a little bit careful here of what's going on. And on top of that, like you mentioned, the British are sending food and weapons and those sort of things officially / unofficially, because, they don't want to ignite a war with the Americans. But this is something where you start to see that this group is starting to grow. But again, conflict is just always around the corner within these groups. Yeah. So here's an example of one that, it was just, again, there's many examples like this. So an example is an American man was killed and scalped. So automatically they assumed that this was a native group attacking an innocent American person. Whether that was true or not, nobody really knows. But it doesn't matter because the thought is already there. So in return, the Americans find a native elder and kill him. And so, okay, now people think we're even. But the native groups say, well, that's, this was just some guy. You killed one of our elders. So they find a group of American troops and murder them all in retaliation. And then it kind of goes back and forth until these leaders like Tecumseh or someone on the American side step in and say, enough is enough. We have to stop. But this is just how easy it is for these conflicts to start rising. And then until someone steps in, they continue to grow and escalate and escalate. And every time somebody's killed, the seeds of hatred between the two groups continue to grow. And like you mentioned, throw treaties that are broken on top of that and those sort of things. And you start to get this view of, Americans seeing, savages and, uncivilized people who we can't trust versus the natives saying you can't trust the Americans. They bring this European way of life where they have no respect for the land and these sort of things. And they're all just about money and expansion and just personal gain and those sort of things. And you really start to see this kind of breakdown. And so Tecumseh's really trying to rein everybody in. I think that was probably his biggest challenge. And so in 1811, he leaves Prophetstown and he's been moving around the U.S. trying to gain more troops and more people to join his cause. But while he's gone, the American forces actually attack Prophetstown. Nothing comes of it initially. But while he's gone, the native groups led by the prophet decide to attack the Americans in what's called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And although the native forces weren't defeated decisively, Prophetstown was destroyed. Many of its inhabitants were killed or scattered. And like I mentioned before, the power of the prophet, right? This prophet who says, I see a vision forward for everybody. He's just got his butt kicked. Prophetstown is destroyed. This symbol of pan-Indian unity is gone. And so now the prophet has gone from this unifying factor to essentially useless, in the sense of he's lost that divine, whatever you want to call it. And so this is another thing where if Tecumseh was there, he would have been able to kind of rally the troops a little bit more, probably wouldn't have done this attack, would have found a way to keep the peace and continue to grow what he's trying to do. But he was off trying to recruit more people, which he definitely needed to do. So this is a huge setback for Tecumseh, because people just disbanded after this. They're like, this whole unity thing is just not going to work. And so he's not gone back to square one, but he's gone significantly farther back. And now he's starting to recognize that, the Americans have defeated them here. His idea of this Confederacy has taken a huge blow. He's starting to understand that the British are being a little bit more friendly, and starting to understand that, maybe he, not something he necessarily wants to do, but he's starting to recognize that allying with the British might be the best thing for the survival of his people, and to be able to maybe tide him over a little bit till he can get to a point where he can maybe reignite what he had going with Prophetstown.
This might be a slippery analogy, and so I'll try to nuance it as best as I can. I think, if based on what you just said, you have this pan-Indigenous group that is, I imagine the ties that bonded them together were not as strong as Tecumseh had wanted or was able to achieve. So you see this kind of symbol of Prophetstown collapsed, right? And I think the role of symbols and power of symbols in history is always so interesting, because they're so difficult to quantify, but they exist and they are very meaningful to these groups for that kind of sense of collective identity. And now he's faced with this very stark reality that, much of his efforts have waned and might have been totally fruitless at this point in time. And now there's a strategic decision point that he has to make, which is, what do I do? Who do I ally with? And I think going back to the sentiment that I said earlier, which is, thy enemy of thy enemy is my friend. Which one do you go with? You have a bit more stasis in Canada with solidified British rule. There's obviously a lot of movement going on still. Canada's going to go through its own expansion, but in parallel, the level of aggressive expansion that's happening in the U.S. is nowhere close to what's happening in Canada at this point in time. So, kind of the strategic analysis he has to do to figure out who to best align with. It's so interesting to kind of consider and think about what he has to decide in his shoes.
Yeah, I think it definitely wasn't I'll just go talk to the British now. I think the seeds had definitely been set, but you're right. I think this was probably that, kick in the butt where he's like, okay, I actually have to go do this now, because the British had been relatively friendly to Tecumseh and his group. We'll get into Sir Isaac Brock in a bit, but kind of leading a lot of the British forces in the Ontario region, had a lot of respect for him. They had met multiple times, and Tecumseh had gone into Canada multiple times to speak to the British and make sure that, just kind of having a mutual understanding of what was going on. And that was something the Americans always looked at and said, well, he's starting to ally himself with the British. And then he would say, no, this is just, I'm not doing any of that. This is a true native Confederacy. But unfortunately, right, like we mentioned, this westward expansion, this violence that's taking place, it's not just between, the natives and the Americans, but, you see the British supporting these groups. And like you said, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now the Americans are starting to look at the British saying, a lot of the troubles we're having in the West, caused by the British, and there's a million other things that kick this off, but the famous War of 1812 is about to start, and this is where Tecumseh is going to really establish himself in Canadian history as a war hero and those sort of things. So yeah, I think this inevitable war that's kind of been teetering for a long time is finally going to kick into high gear, and we'll see how Tecumseh plays a key role in one part of that theater. Yeah,
and I think the inevitability of it is such a interesting question, right? And it's hard to say it wasn't inevitable when you consider this very aggressive expansion that's happening westward. In my mind, wouldn't it make sense to expand northwards as well? But yeah, as we'll see. So the War of 1812 is, the key conflict that we're going to look at between the U.S. and Britain and Canada. It lasted 3 years, from 1812 to 1815. So essentially, the rationale for the invasion. The U.S. wants to conquer Canada. Several reasons. Obviously, we've talked about their expansionist ambitions, but there's also economic interests and security concerns. Again, driven by this kind of ideology of manifest destiny, Canada is, rich in fertile land. It has valuable fur trade routes and kind of promises very significant economic benefits. So strategically controlling Canada would not only weaken British influence and provide greater security against future threats from Britain, but especially as British support for native tribes, such as those led by Tecumseh, had fueled resistance against American expansionism. So this desire to kind of retaliate against British actions, including trade restrictions and this idea of impressment of American sailors, which is essentially like holding captive of other soldiers to bring them into your military, had further motivated, this kind of idea of U.S. going into Canada to conquer them as a way to assert American dominance, protect their own economic interests, enhance national pride. And you see this as evidenced by early American invasions and key battles like Queenston Heights and the failed attempts to secure Montreal. And probably an interesting footnote during the War of 1812 is the role of France. So France was actually not directly involved, but the ongoing Napoleonic Wars actually influenced the conflict quite a bit. So Napoleon's continental system and Britain's retaliatory blockade disrupted American trade, leading to, very stark economic hardship and, again, heightening tensions. The British practice of impressing soldiers, which is, again, kind of co-opting them and taking them by force to serve under their flag, had partly driven by their naval needs against France, further provoked the U.S. In terms of these diplomatic failures and economic pressures, which were exacerbated by the broader European conflict. So again, you're seeing this entanglement of these geopolitical forces still in this particular theater of conflict. So all of this kind of comes together to contribute to the U.S. decision to declare war on Britain, making France's indirect role crucial in shaping the war's context and long-term dynamics.
Seems just like rinse and repeat again, right? How do we start this episode off? 7 Years' War, the grand European conflict between French and British forces having a North American theater, right? It's, again, not as direct because there's a new nation involved this time, but you're right. The French are going to, any way they can get back against the British, and the British are going to do what they can to weaken the French. So yeah, it's kind of maybe it kicked off in North America in that sense, but again, it's going to be influenced heavily by what's going on in Europe, and especially from a resourcing perspective, right? I'd be interested to see how much the British were saying, we need to stop Napoleon in Europe, but is how much resources should we put against, blocking the Americans, from coming to Canada? And there's always, I'm sure, was an ongoing discussion throughout this time.
And I think that just speaks to the importance of the alliance between the British and the Indigenous groups, right? They are fighting a two-front battle right now with Napoleon on the European continent and having to now do battle with a growing America in North America. So in terms of key battles and campaigns, so obviously there's the broad scope of the invasion of Canada. So there were some early attempts to invade Canada, which were largely unsuccessful. They're marked by key defeats at battles at Queenston Heights and Beaver's Dam, 1812 and 1813, respectively. And then despite some initial successes, American forces actually struggled to secure a foothold in British-held Canadian territories. In terms of naval battles, so the war saw significant naval battles on the Great Lakes and the Atlantic Ocean. The USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, did actually achieve notable victories against British ships, boosting American morale. As we know, Britain is the foremost naval power probably to ever exist in the modern era. So to have a naval battle go for the U.S. is obviously a massive morale boost. Then there's more defensive battles. So there's the defense of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, which is inspired by Francis Key Scott to write the Star-Spangled Banner. So you're seeing some of the legacy of it. The British burned Washington, D.C. in 1814, including the White House and the Capitol, but were repelled at the Battle of Baltimore. There's also Southern campaigns. So you have General Andrew Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, which was a major American success, although it occurred after the peace treaty was signed. And then you have Jackson's campaign against the Creek Nation, which culminated in the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend, which weakened Native American resistance in the Southeast. So there's the complexity of the battles that are happening are pretty far and wide, but ultimately there's also this Indigenous involvement that's going on. So you do have Tecumseh at this point who's allied with the British to resist American expansion into native territories, because it is, ultimately these alliances do have a degree of self-service. They have to, which is why, you see this alliance take place. And in terms of the impact on native tribes, so the war obviously disrupted these Native American alliances and further weakened their resistance to like long-term American expansion because they had allied themselves with Canada. But, as we'll see, and we won't talk about it too much today, but these post-war treaties that we're talking about after 1812 ultimately would lead to, massive land cessions and displacement for native tribes. And I think that's a story that we constantly hear in Canadian history because of how these treaties weren't actually, upheld long term.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's interesting, as you mentioned, kind of like how continental this war is. It's happening throughout, almost the entire continent. But even when we look at where Tecumseh's kind of playing his role, it's like almost like kind of off to the side. It's kind of, whenever I looked at a map of like all the battles, you kind of just see everything kind of happening along the coast in the major cities. But a little bit more westward, we start to see, Tecumseh and his group, really playing more crucial roles in some of those battles, which some historians say weren't as influential in the grand scheme of things, but definitely played a factor in, an inevitable, British/Native/Canadian victory. So one of those battles is the Siege of Detroit in August of 1812, where American forces were, I guess, as the story goes, were intimidated so much by Tecumseh's warriors that they just surrendered without a fight. And so this, again, early on in the war was a huge sign of, morale boost for the British and the Native group, saying, okay, together, we can do this. And I think one of the most important parts of all of this is Tecumseh's relationship with Sir Isaac Brock, who is the commander of the British forces. And they definitely have a mutual respect for each other. They are consistently talking strategy. They're seeing each other as close to equals as probably you could see. But it's important because the British definitely have this superiority about them. They have this great army, the Redcoats and stuff, where Brock understands the limitations of his group and understands how his team or his group can work alongside Tecumseh's warriors as well. And that relationship works really, really well until Sir Isaac Brock is tragically killed. I think it's in the Battle of Niagara Falls. And his replacement, Proctor is the guy's name, has the complete opposite view of Tecumseh. He's considered a bit of a coward, at least by Tecumseh. He's not as decisive as Brock, and he doesn't really see this as a, mutual alliance. It's more of it's almost the way I would say is like the Romans would have like auxiliary forces sometimes, where it was just like the Romans deal with it and we throw the auxiliaries at what we need to. That's kind of how Proctor's looking at this situation. And this is where we start to see the Americans starting to gain a little bit more ground in the theater that Tecumseh's fighting in. And we see a lot of frustration from Tecumseh, a lot of writers talking about how he was known for being very blunt and just telling Proctor right to his face that you're a coward and you don't know what you're doing. And, he would never speak like that to Brock. So I think, there's some desperation kicking in here, but Tecumseh, he's kind of had enough of this guy. And, it's starting to show, right, as the Americans are starting to move into Ontario more and more. And, the British and the Native forces are, starting to retreat deeper into the province.
Yeah, it's interesting, the relationship between Sir Isaac Brock and Tecumseh, and then Tecumseh with Proctor. I think kind of reflect on some of the other episodes that we've done. And there's other examples where you have leaders from two totally disparate worlds, cultures, civilizations, but there's this degree of mutual respect where leaders respect other leaders. And I think that's such an interesting theme that we see across some of our episodes. And then when, Sir Isaac Brock dies, Proctor comes in, and Tecumseh's not really a big fan of his leadership style because, he's worked with, such a great general before.
Yeah. And I think for Tecumseh, like, he's known for not backing down from a fight. He's smart. He'll retreat when he needs to. He does certain things when he needs to, but he keeps, pushing, saying we need to have a decisive battle because all we're going to do is retreat and the Americans are going to continue to get stronger and, we're eventually going to have to fight them. And so eventually that does happen where they kind of almost reluctantly say, okay, we need to have a battle now. We have to stop the Americans because they're going to continue coming in and taking what they want and being able to set up more in that space. So this all kind of accumulates at the Battle of the Thames on October 5th, 1813. So basically leading a combined force of Native and British troops. Tecumseh, he's fighting bravely in this situation, but he's tragically killed in this battle. So the death, we don't really know how it happened. There's endless numbers of stories. Some eyewitnesses talk about how, he was wounded and he told his troops to retreat and, give me a pistol. I'll stand till the last, I'll take some down with me sort of thing, which, probably sensationalized a little bit, but knowing what we know of Tecumseh, he definitely was anything but a coward. So, I wouldn't be surprised if, he definitely was, fighting to the very last breath that he had in his body. But, he dies and any remnants of this Pan-Indian Confederation cease to exist at this point. And it was the end of really any organized Native American resistance in the Northwest Territory. So not only, is he fighting to kind of protect what, his beliefs, but he's also a symbol. And we talked about this earlier, right? His Prophetstown was a symbol, but Tecumseh is also a symbol. So him, not being around anymore, ends this hope that he had to really bring these Native forces together. And, the British are now seeing, not really going to have the same respect for that group because Tecumseh was, someone that at least someone like Brock or any good general could understand the strengths of. So despite his death, his legacy really endured. He's remembered as one of the most important Native American leaders of all time. He's this vision of a united Native American Confederacy. His bravery in battle, has been a symbol of resistance against oppression and just kind of that overall freedom. And, there's, monuments, places, cultural references where, you can't walk very far in Canada without seeing some reference to him. And I think it's interesting to see because, we talk about this a lot in Canada around, you don't see a lot of, things named after Native groups or Native people, but Tecumseh's one of the big exceptions, mainly because, there's the British influence where you can see the British had respect for him. Therefore, he's going to get the respect and, the names, places named after him and that kind of stuff. So I think when it comes, to a legacy perspective, we can see all the things that he accomplished, but to the fact that, the British are seeing him as this great leader and great general who died, essentially in their eyes fighting for the British and fighting for Canada, he goes down and, in history as one of the great people and kind of keeping, helping Canada remain a country. And, who knows how things would have changed. But yeah, that's Tecumseh. And I think we'll get into a little bit more of maybe his legacy, but yeah, that's him.
It's an extraordinary story, right? And I think it's an important one when we talk about Canadian history. Again, like I said at the onset, Canadian history is not boring. And I think this episode hopefully kind of delineates what most people think about Canadian history, and the reality of it is that it's extremely complicated, and the role at which Indigenous groups are involved. And when you have these kind of figureheads like Tecumseh, it makes it much more real to understand the complexity of what these groups are going through when they're wedged in, this very, stark battle, but with really young powers that are growing on both sides. Like, it is such an amazingly complicated but extraordinary narrative that I think gets sometimes lost in Canadian history because we focus on things that are much more tangible when we're talking about, the role of the British. We're talking about the Hudson's Bay Company. But I think it's stories like this that really bring out the kind of the importance and the interesting part of Canadian history.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I like his story the most because we have, we see this a lot with Native recollections of certain things. It's usually one European group and a Native group. And when you try to look at the history, you typically have the European group who's more farther along when it comes to literacy and writing and, documenting things historically. So you always get this bias, right? And not saying that we don't see a bias with Tecumseh, but we see kind of this three-way historical analysis where you have the British, you have the Americans, and you have the Native groups with all very different views of the world. But one thing that they kind of get together is, and all agree on is, they'll disagree on specifics and they'll disagree on his impact and those sort of things, but they all agree that he was a great leader, fantastic speaker, and a really good diplomat too. So we talk about him as a warrior, right? But he's also a great diplomat. He's someone who can get himself out of a sticky situation through diplomacy before just diving headfirst into battle. But when it comes time to, to pull out the hatchet and really get to battle, he's someone that's going to do that. So I think that's kind of what I take away from this is everyone around him is kind of speaking the same language. And he's also someone who can, fight when he needs to, speak when he needs to, bring people together. And it's always interesting to, he'd be someone who would run for president one day, right? Or something like that if he was born into a world where, maybe he had a little bit more of a defined road to get to the top, because I think he has all the skills necessary for, being a great leader in whatever world he was. But, the world he lived in, he definitely took the most of it and definitely went down, in history as one of the greats.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's such a great way to wrap it up in terms of just like a broad reflection and looking back on all the things we've learned about leadership from our episodes. I think he has the hallmarks of, every great leader we've talked about in terms of oration skills, in terms of his communication abilities, bringing people together. Selling a broad idea is very, very difficult. And obviously then work out the way that he had planned, but he did have some success. And then just kind of the strategic brilliance on how to decide who to align with and how it would best serve, his group and his ideas and his objectives, while still having this kind of mutual respect with, great leaders like Sir Isaac Brock.
100%. I couldn't have said it any better. So yeah, I think we'll wrap up there for this week. And we'll be back a couple of weeks with another episode. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks everyone. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.